A warm sun had just risen over the coastline when life in the small seaside town suddenly changed forever. The town was peaceful, the kind of place where people greeted each other by name and children played barefoot in the sand. Fishermen were preparing their boats for the day, and women were setting up small market stalls with fruits and handmade goods. But deep beneath the calm surface of the ocean, something terrifying had been building. Silent, unseen, unstoppable. It began with a low rumble, so soft that many ignored it at first. Birds suddenly flew away in large flocks as if they sensed something before any human could. Then the sea started to pull back from the shore in a strange and unnatural way, exposing the ocean floor. People stood in confusion. Boats that had floated peacefully just moments before were now resting on mud and sand. Children pointed and laughed, not understanding what was coming. But a few elders who had heard stories passed down through generations felt their hearts freeze with fear. There was no time to warn anyone. In the next moment, a monstrous wall of water rose on the horizon. It was not a normal wave, it was a towering force of destruction. Before anyone could scream, the water crashed into the town with unimaginable power. Homes were torn off their foundations. Boats were thrown into the air like toys. People ran in panic, calling out for loved ones. The peaceful town was swallowed in chaos, in sound, and devastation. Within minutes, everything changed. The sea that had once been a friend now became the greatest enemy the town had ever known. The roads turned to rivers of debris. Families were separated. People climbed onto rooftops, clinging to whatever they could find, hoping the water would stop rising. As the hours passed, the town that had once been alive with laughter and music now stood silent except for the sounds of wind, dripping water, and distant cries for help. The sun set that evening on a place that barely looked like it existed just that morning. Electricity was gone. Communication lines were destroyed. Food and clean water were nowhere to be found. Injured people lay in makeshift shelters made from broken wood and sheet metal. The air was thick with fear and uncertainty. Some people had lost everything, their homes, their belongings, even their family members. Yet in the middle of this heartbreak, there was still a tiny spark of hope. Someone had managed to power an old radio transmitter using car batteries. Late into the night, under a sky filled with stars and the faint scent of salt water and smoke, a small group gathered around that radio. They were cold, hungry, and frightened, but they were also determined. A young schoolteacher held the microphone in trembling hands. Her voice was tired but strong as she called out into the darkness. "This is a message from the coastal town of Harinagar. We have been hit by a disaster. We are without food, water, and medical help. Many are injured. We are cut off from all roads and communication. If anyone can hear this, we need help. Please, anyone. We only need basic aid to survive." She repeated the message again and again, unsure if it was reaching anyone. The group around her sat in silence, their faces lit only by the flickering light of a small lantern. Some cried quietly, others stared ahead, too shocked to speak. In that moment, they were not asking for miracles. They were asking for the smallest things: water to drink, medicine for the wounded, blankets to keep warm. They did not know if help would ever come. They only knew they had to try. As the radio signal traveled into the night, the people of Harinagar lay on the cold ground, hungry and exhausted. The children shivered. Mothers tried to comfort them with gentle words, though they themselves were filled with fear. The sound of the waves still echoed in their ears like a warning that more danger could come. Yet through the darkness, the town held on to the belief that somewhere, someone might hear their plea. Unknown to them, at that very moment, thousands of kilometers away, a radio enthusiast sitting in a quiet room was tuning through different frequencies, searching for distant signals from around the world. His equipment was old, but his passion for listening to distant voices was strong. He adjusted the dial slightly and then he heard it, the faint, trembling voice of the schoolteacher from Harinagar. He leaned forward, heart pounding, trying to catch every word. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. The voice was weak, but the desperation was unmistakable. He quickly wrote down the coordinates mentioned in the message. He knew he had to act immediately. Without wasting a second, he contacted emergency response networks, amateur radio groups, and online communities. He posted the message on social platforms with the simple caption, "They are asking for basic aid. We must respond." While the people of Harinagar slept under the stars, unaware of what was happening beyond the destroyed coastline, their message had begun its journey. One person had heard them. One person had cared enough to act. And sometimes one person is all it takes to start a wave much bigger than any disaster. The people of Harinagar had no idea what the next sunrise would bring. They felt alone and forgotten, but fate had already begun moving in their favor. Humanity had heard their cry not as a distant tragedy, but as a shared responsibility. In that moment of silence after the radio was turned off, as the schoolteacher looked out over her broken town, she whispered to herself, "Even if only one heart hears us, it will be enough." She had no way of knowing that soon not just one heart, but thousands around the world would hear her voice and answer in a way that would go beyond anything she could ever imagine. The night was silent in Harinagar, but in the outside world something powerful had begun. The desperate radio message that was sent into darkness started moving through the world like a spark in dry grass. What was meant as a simple call for help started spreading across countries, across languages, and into the hearts of strangers who had never even heard the name Harinagar before. It began with the man who heard it first. He didn't sleep at all that night. His hands moved quickly from radio to computer, from computer to phone. He translated the message into different languages using online tools. He posted it everywhere he could: international forums, social media pages, emergency aid networks. His heart raced with urgency. He imagined the people who spoke those words. He imagined mothers holding their children close in the dark, elders lying without medicine, people searching for clean water. He could not close his eyes knowing that every minute mattered. Slowly, first in whispers, then in strong voices, people began to take notice. At first, a few kind-hearted individuals responded online. They offered prayers, then they offered ideas. Some asked where to donate. Others tagged organizations. Within an hour, the post had thousands of shares. What made it even more powerful was its simplicity. They did not ask for money or luxury. They were only asking for basic aid. That touched something deep in people. It felt human. It felt immediate. People realized this was not a distant tragedy. It was a cry from real people, and the whole world had accidentally overheard it. A woman in Spain who had survived a similar disaster in her childhood started crying when she heard the message. Without hesitation, she began calling local NGOs, insisting they pay attention. In Japan, a group of fishermen who had lost their homes in a tsunami just years ago immediately decided they would send boats if needed. In South Africa, a small charity that usually only handled local work announced an emergency global fundraiser for Harinagar. All of this happened before the sun even rose in the small, broken town that had sent the message. By morning, journalists had begun picking it up. The story was shocking in its purity. A town destroyed, a voice carried by radio waves, and a request so basic it shook the souls of millions. The headline appeared in different parts of the world at nearly the same time. Coastal town begs for basic aid. Will the world listen? And the world did listen. The hashtag #DashenHelpHarinagar started trending. People who had never met each other began working together like they were family. A group of college students in Canada stayed awake all night, creating maps and attempting to pinpoint the exact location of the town using satellite images. They identified the damaged shoreline and shared it with major rescue organizations. A famous athlete with millions of followers posted a short video pleading for immediate action. Within minutes, donations began pouring in. Not just money, but also offers of ships, helicopters, and skilled volunteers. Meanwhile, in Harinagar, the people still had no idea what was happening in the rest of the world. Their food was almost gone. The children were growing weaker. The wounded were in pain, and the rain had begun to fall, soaking through the temporary shelters. The town's old radio operator sat beside the young teacher, adjusting the frequency again, trying to repeat the message. But now, the world was already moving. Private citizens with boats called their friends. NGO leaders contacted their networks. A cargo ship company offered to redirect one of their ships filled with supplies to the nearest port to Harinagar, even though it would cost them financially. "We can calculate profit later," the owner said. "Right now, we must calculate humanity." On the other side of the world, a retired Navy officer read the story while eating breakfast. His hands trembled as he put down his newspaper. He knew from experience that time was the greatest enemy after a disaster. He immediately contacted former colleagues. Within a few hours, 3 large ships and 4 medical vessels were being prepared to sail. They were not sent by government orders. They were sent by human hearts. What began as a request for a few boxes of aid had now turned into something far greater than anyone ever expected. It was no longer about basic survival. It was becoming a symbol of global unity. People from different religions, races, and countries all looked at this one broken town and saw themselves. They saw their mothers, their brothers, their children, their grandparents. They did not just want to help, they felt they had to. Messages of hope began streaming in from people all around the world. A child in Brazil sent a voice message saying, "I am saving my lunch money to help the children of Harinagar." A group of monks in Nepal offered prayers and promised to send medical herbs and volunteers. A billionaire businessman anonymously contributed enough funds to build temporary housing for the entire town. When asked why, he simply said, "Because they asked." In a control room at a major international relief center, maps covered the walls. Experts were marking sea routes. Volunteers were organizing supply chains. Someone pointed at the map and said, "They asked for basic aid. We will not send just a box. We will send fleets." Across ports and harbors around the world, something extraordinary was happening. One by one, ships began preparing to depart. These were not just government Navy ships. They were private yachts, fishing boats, Coast Guard vessels, cargo ships, medical ships, and even personal sailboats. Some were large and strong, able to carry huge loads of supplies. Others were small and humble, carrying only what they could. But every ship, no matter how big or small, set out with one mission: reach Harinagar. The people boarding these ships came from every walk of life. There were doctors, nurses, chefs, engineers, teachers, divers, and simple men and women with no special skills, only the desire to help. They packed food, blankets, medicine, water filters, solar lights, tools, and letters of hope written by children from around the world. Some people even packed instruments so they could sing for the survivors, believing that healing does not only come from medicine, but from love and human connection. As the fleets prepared to depart, news cameras captured the powerful image of ships lined up at harbors across continents, their horns echoing through the air. When asked why they were going, one captain simply said, "Because someone called for help, and that means someone must answer." Back in Harinagar, the townspeople still struggled through the next day. They searched for lost family members among the ruins. They tried to clean the polluted water by filtering it through cloth. They rationed the last bits of food. They prayed silently that someone somewhere had heard them. They had no idea that their message had become a movement so massive that it would soon be written into history. But in the evening, just as the sky turned pink and the wind grew softer, the young school teacher thought she heard something in the distance. It was too faint to be sure, like a whisper coming from the ocean. She paused, held her breath, and listened again. For a moment, the pain in her heart lifted without reason, as if some invisible force had touched her soul and said, "Hold on, help is coming." She looked at the people around her, the tired faces, the tearful eyes, the broken spirits, and she felt a sudden sense of calm she could not explain. It was as if a promise had been made by the world itself, even though no ship was yet visible on the horizon. But the promise was real. What had started as a small message, spoken by trembling lips in a dark night, had now grown into the loudest call to humanity the world had heard in years. The oceans were preparing to carry not just aid, but a miracle born from compassion. They had asked for basic aid. What they were about to receive was far beyond anything they could have imagined. The winds over the ocean grew stronger as ships from different nations began moving across the water, all heading in the same direction, with one shared goal: saving the people of Harinagar. Some ships came from nearby countries. Others traveled from the opposite side of the world. They were not led by one government, nor organized under any single flag. They were led by something far more powerful: human kindness. But even though the world was responding like never before, the journey was not easy. On the sea, nature tested their courage. The waves rose high, crashing hard against the sides of the ships. The winds howled as if trying to push them back. In some places, heavy rain made it almost impossible to see the horizon. But no one turned back. Captains gripped their steering wheels with determination. Volunteers held onto railings as water splashed over the decks. Every person on those ships knew that on the other side of those waves, people were waiting. People with no food, no shelter, no medicine. That belief gave them the strength to keep going. Inside the ships, life was busy. Volunteers worked day and night. They organized supplies, food, water filters, medical kits, blankets, tents. Doctors set up emergency treatment areas, preparing to treat wounds, diseases, and trauma. Engineers studied maps and created plans for rebuilding homes and roads. Even children who had joined with their parents helped tie boxes, label supplies, or make small handwritten notes of hope to place inside the packages. One doctor, a woman who had worked in war zones, stood on the deck of her ship with a stethoscope around her neck and tears in her eyes. "This isn't just aid," she said quietly to a volunteer beside her. "This is humanity rising." Meanwhile, far away in Harinagar, time was moving painfully slow. Every morning the survivors woke up hoping that today would be different, that today help would arrive. They climbed to the highest points to scan the horizon, but the ocean remained empty. Children asked their parents, "Is anyone coming?" The parents forced themselves to smile, even though inside their hearts were heavy with doubt. Water had become dangerously scarce. The salty floodwater was unfit to drink, and the remaining freshwater sources were polluted. Some people walked miles barefoot over broken ground in search of clean water, only to return empty-handed. Hunger was growing. The little food remaining was shared equally, but even then it was never enough. People grew weaker with each passing day. In the center of the broken town, a temporary shelter had been made using pieces of tin and cloth. Inside, the wounded lay in silence. A man with a leg injury tried to stay still, but the pain was unbearable. A mother held her sick child, praying for medicine. The school teacher who had sent the radio message walked among them, offering words of comfort even though she had none left for herself. Yet there was still one thing that survived the disaster: hope. Every night, survivors gathered around a small fire. They told stories of better days. They reminded each other that human beings were not cruel by nature, that somewhere out there people must be trying to reach them. Even when their stomachs were empty and their bodies in pain, they did not let go of that belief. On one of those nights, when the stars shone brightly over the ruins, a little boy stood up and spoke. His voice was weak, but his words were powerful. "I know the world has not forgotten us," he said. "Because if the ocean can bring destruction, it can also bring help. Maybe help is already on the way." His words spread through the crowd like warm light. It felt as if the entire town breathed in a little bit of strength. And indeed, far away, help was coming. But it was not just the sea that stood in the way. There were political challenges too. Some countries wanted to control the aid. Others worried about sending ships into dangerous waters without permission. There were meetings, arguments, and confusion. But then something remarkable happened. The people of the world refused to let politics delay compassion. They began calling their leaders, sending emails, posting videos that went viral. They used their voices to say one thing: this is not about borders. This is about lives. People from different countries who normally disagreed on many issues finally agreed on one truth: humanity must come first. Soon even governments that were slow to respond were inspired by their own citizens. Emergency permissions were granted. Fuel was provided for ships. Air routes were cleared for helicopters and planes to join the mission. The world, piece by piece, began to move in unity. Back on the ships, spirits were high despite the stormy weather. People from different nations spoke different languages, but they laughed together, shared meals, and encouraged each other. A fisherman from Greece shared bread with a doctor from India. A sailor from Brazil taught a song of hope to volunteers from South Korea. On one ship every evening, the crew gathered to light a single candle and say the same words: "Let this light reach them." That light, though small, symbolized the spirit that now filled every person on that ocean. As the fleets moved closer to Harinagar, they received updated information through satellite images. The town was worse than what they had imagined. Roads were destroyed. Forests were gone. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. The coastline had changed shape entirely. This made the mission even more urgent. They held emergency meetings on board. They discussed how to approach the shore, how to land safely, where to set up first aid stations. They spoke about how to comfort the survivors, not just with supplies but with dignity and respect. They planned not only to rebuild homes but to rebuild lives. On one ship, a group of volunteers gathered around a world map that had been pinned to a wall. They placed their hands on it and closed their eyes. None of them were religious in the same way, but all of them believed in something greater than themselves. the belief that humanity is strongest when united. Meanwhile, in Harinagar, the weather began to change. The sky, which had been cloudy and gray for days, slowly started to clear. A gentle breeze blew, and the smell of salt in the air turned fresher. Birds began to return. In the destroyed town, people noticed these changes. Some said it was nature giving them a sign. Others simply lifted their heads and smiled. The school teacher, who had not slept properly since the day of the disaster, walked up the hill that overlooked the sea. She stood alone, feeling the morning sun on her face. Her heart, once heavy with grief, now felt strangely calm. And then it happened. Far on the horizon, just where the sky meets the sea, she saw something. So small at first that she thought it might be a trick of her eyes. But it was not a cloud or a wave. It was something else. Something moving. She stared harder. Her breath caught in her throat. A ship, then another, and another. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. The fleets were coming. The people of Harinagar had asked for basic aid. What they were about to receive was an entire world moving toward them, not with pity, but with love. Not with sympathy, but with unity. The ocean that had once brought destruction was now bringing hope, carried gently on the waves by thousands of hearts beating as one. The miracle had begun. The sky over Harinagar slowly brightened with the first colors of dawn as the townspeople gathered along the ruined coast. Their hearts were beating fast, not from fear this time, but from a strange feeling they had almost forgotten, hope. For days their eyes had stared at the empty horizon, expecting nothing, but today it was different. Today the sea whispered a promise. The schoolteacher, who had become an unspoken guide for the town, stood at the front of the crowd. Her clothes were worn, her face tired, but her eyes were fixed firmly on the horizon. She could see tiny dots in the distance. At first she wasn't sure if they were ships or just shadows of clouds, but as the sun rose higher, those dots began to shine like silver against the water. Then someone shouted, "They're coming!" A wave of energy moved through the people. Even the injured tried to sit up. Mothers lifted their children to see. The old and weak held on to each other, tears filling their eyes. After so many days of hunger and silence, this moment came like a miracle. The dots grew larger. One ship became visible, then another, then an entire line of them, stretching across the horizon like a breathtaking miracle. These were not just aid ships. They were ships of every kind: Navy vessels, medical ships, fishing boats, private yachts, cargo ships, rescue boats, and even small personal sailboats. Some flew flags of different nations. Others bore banners with messages of hope. "We are with you. You are not alone. Humanity stands together." The sea, which had once brought destruction, now carried salvation. As the first ship approached the shore, its horn echoed across the waves. It was not just a sound, it was a declaration to the people of Harinagar. "We heard you. We are here for you." People fell to their knees. Some shouted in joy, others cried openly. The children, who had forgotten what it felt like to smile, began laughing. It was as if the entire town had come back to life. Small boats were lowered into the water. Volunteers rowed toward the shore, carrying boxes of emergency supplies. Doctors in white coats jumped out as soon as they reached the shallow water, not waiting for boats to fully land. They ran to the injured, kneeling beside them, checking pulses, giving medicine. A woman who had been unable to walk for days due to infection was given immediate treatment. A child with fever was carried gently to a medical tent. A man who had lost all strength was handed a packet of high-nutrition food and water. The look on his face was not just relief. It was gratitude so deep it could not be described in words. The unloading of supplies began quickly and efficiently. Food, water, and medical kits were passed hand to hand in a human chain. No one thought about their nationality, their profession, or their status. They were simply humans helping humans. On one side of the shore, engineers were already assessing the broken roads. Volunteers set up large tents that could serve as temporary homes for families who had lost everything. Teams set up water filtration units to provide clean drinking water. Generators were brought in to restore electricity. Mobile kitchens were built to serve fresh, hot meals to everyone who needed them. The people of Harinagar could hardly believe what they were seeing. They had expected maybe one ship, maybe a few boxes of aid. But this was something else. This was not aid. It was an entire fleet of love. As more ships arrived, the coastline became alive with activity. Helicopters took off from the decks of larger ships. carrying heavy equipment inland where boats could not reach. Drones flew over the land to find people who might still be trapped. Rescue dogs, brought from across the world, were guided into the damaged areas to search for survivors. A famous doctor stepped off one of the ships and immediately went to work, not caring about cameras or recognition. A group of monks from a faraway country walked quietly through the crowd, handing out food while whispering prayers for peace. Soldiers from different nations stood side by side, not with weapons, but with tools to help rebuild. Even the fishermen of Harinagar, who had lost their boats, stood watching in amazement as fishermen from other countries approached them, carrying new fishing nets and equipment. One fisherman from Greece took the hands of an old fisherman from Harinagar and said in simple English, "Brother, the sea took. Now we give back." The residents of Harinagar could not speak. Their eyes were wet with emotion. They had thought their story would be forgotten. Instead, people they had never met, people who did not speak their language, people from thousands of miles away, had come all this way for them, not for fame, not for money, but for humanity. The schoolteacher stood at the shoreline as a young volunteer approached her. She was a girl no older than 19 with a medical bag over her shoulder and determination in her eyes. "Are you the one who sent the radio message?" the girl asked. The teacher nodded slowly. The young volunteer smiled. "People around the world heard your voice," they said. "If one voice can speak for a town, then thousands of hands can answer. And so here we are." The teacher felt her legs weaken. She had held her town together with courage even when she was afraid. Now, for the first time since the disaster struck, she allowed herself to cry, not from sorrow but from relief. As the day passed, the fleet continued to arrive, ship after ship, boat after boat. What began as a simple call for basic aid had become a global mission, unlike any seen before. Families were given fresh clothes. Doctors performed surgeries in makeshift operating rooms. Volunteers rebuilt broken shelters. Psychologists provided comfort to those who had lost family members. Children were gathered into safe spaces where they were given toys, books, and the most precious gift of all, hope for tomorrow. In the evening, when the sun began to set, lights from the ships illuminated the coastline like stars that had come down to earth. Music began playing softly from one of the boats. A singer from another country stood at the bow of her ship, singing a song of peace in her language. The words were unfamiliar, but the feeling was universal. People held hands. Some closed their eyes. Others simply looked at the sky and whispered thanks. That night, Harinagar slept peacefully for the first time since the disaster. The wind was calm. The sea was gentle. And instead of darkness, the town was surrounded by light. Light from the ships, light from lanterns, light from hearts filled with kindness. They had asked for basic aid, but humanity did not respond with just aid. Humanity responded with its entire heart. With every wave that touched the shore, the ocean seemed to say the same words over and over again. "You are not alone. The world is with you." When the sun rose the next morning, it did not shine upon a land of despair. It shone upon a land of rebirth. Harinagar, once silent and broken, was now filled with life, movement, and purpose. The people were no longer just survivors. They had become witnesses to one of the greatest acts of global unity in history. What had begun as a desperate cry for basic aid had transformed into a powerful symbol of what humanity can do when it chooses compassion over indifference. As ships continued to arrive, carrying not just supplies but expertise, the town began to transform. Large tents became proper shelters. Temporary clinics turned into functioning hospitals. Engineers and architects from different countries came together to design earthquake-resistant homes. Volunteers who were carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and builders all worked side by side with the locals, not as outsiders, but as brothers and sisters. Every day brought a new miracle. A group of teachers arrived from different continents. They gathered the children under a big tent and began classes. The children, who had seen darkness too early in their lives, now sat with pencils and notebooks, their eyes glowing with a new kind of light. Hope. They learned not only math and reading, but also stories of kindness from around the world. One child raised his hand and asked, "Why are they doing all this for us?" The teacher smiled and replied, "Because the world has finally remembered that every life matters." Clean water started flowing again. thanks to new filtration systems installed by volunteers. Electricity was restored with the help of donated solar panels. Instead of waiting in fear, people were now standing in lines to receive tools to help rebuild their own homes. The sound of hammers and saws echoed in the air, not as noise, but as music of new beginnings. But the most beautiful transformation happened not in the town's buildings, but in its people. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before were now working hand in hand. Young people who had once dreamed of leaving the town forever now spoke of staying to make it the strongest and most beautiful place in the region. Children, who had been silent from trauma just days ago, were now laughing, playing, singing. There was no longer a feeling of loss in the air, but a feeling of togetherness. The fleets did not stop at just helping Harinagar. They began moving supplies to smaller nearby villages affected by the same disaster. The story of Harinagar had awakened something powerful in the world, an understanding that we are not many nations but one human family. What happened to one town reminded everyone that tragedy does not recognize borders, and neither should kindness. Journalists from around the world came to witness what was happening, expecting to find sadness. Instead, they found inspiration. They reported stories not of destruction but of unity. News programs showed footage of people from different countries embracing, building together, eating together. The image of volunteers forming a human chain to pass supplies, not caring about religion, language, or nationality, became the most shared image in the world. In many cities, people gathered in public squares to watch live updates from Harinagar. They cheered when they saw new homes being completed. They cried when they saw a grandmother walk out of a medical tent smiling again. They clapped when a group of children raised a new flag on top of a rebuilt school. Not the flag of any nation, but a white flag with a symbol of two hands holding each other. The story of Harinagar was no longer about a disaster. It had become a lesson that when people ask for help, humanity should not look away. A lesson that hope is the strongest force on earth. A lesson that even when nature destroys, humans can rebuild stronger, kinder, wiser. Weeks passed, and the town was no longer recognizable as the place that had once been crushed by disaster. Streets were cleared, houses rebuilt, schools reopened. But something else had been built too: confidence, pride, and most importantly, unity. A ceremony was held to thank everyone who had come to help. But when the time came to speak, none of the international volunteers accepted credit. Instead, they turned to the people of Harinagar and said, "You are the reason we are here. Your courage called to us. You believed someone would come, and that belief changed the world." The school teacher stood before the crowd. She looked at the faces before her. Faces of people who had once been filled with fear, now glowing with hope. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but this time it was not from fear. It was from pride. "We asked for help," she said softly, "but what we received was love. We asked for aid, but what we gained was family. Our town may have been broken by the sea, but our hearts have been rebuilt by the world." People clapped, not just for her, but for each other. Every clap was a promise that they would carry this spirit forward. They would rebuild not only their town, but their humanity. After the ceremony, something extraordinary happened. The people of Harinagar, now surrounded by ships from all over the world, made a decision. They said, "We have received help. Now it is our turn to give." They formed a committee to support disaster relief in other parts of the world. They began collecting extra supplies to send to other suffering communities. They promised that whenever another town, another village, or another soul would cry out for help, Harinagar would be the first to respond, because they understood deeply what it means to be in the darkness waiting for someone to care. The fleet slowly began to leave, but they did not leave behind emptiness. They left behind gardens blooming again. They left behind clinics full of medicine. They left behind roads that led to a future, and most importantly, they left behind a town filled with people who had learned the true meaning of strength. Not strength built on power, but strength built on unity. As the final ship drifted away, its horn echoing across the sea, the people of Harinagar stood together, hands joined. They did not feel abandoned. They did not feel sad. They felt proud. They felt ready. The town that had once been on its knees now stood tall, not because it had been saved, but because it had been awakened. They had asked for basic aid, but what they received was a reminder that in the heart of every human being, No matter where they live or what language they speak, there is an ocean of kindness ready to rise. And when that ocean rises, not in destruction but in compassion, it can build a future more powerful than any storm in history. Harinagar was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a living example of the greatest truth in the world. When humanity stands together, miracles are no longer miracles. They become reality.